Today is June the 27th, 2011. My name is Clinton Risner. I will be the interviewer and the videographer. And the interview's name is Raquel Amado Bortnick.
Rachel, but that's okay.
Oh, Rachel Amado Bortnick. Okay, I shall call you Rachel in this interview. Thank you. Place of interview is in Dallas, Texas, and in the home of Rachel Amado Bortnick. We're going to begin about your family, Rachel. Tell me about your family, parents, grandparents, where and when you were born, and how did you happen to settle in Dallas? And what did your parents do for a living?
It is a very long story, but I'll tell you. I was born in 1938 in Izmir, Turkey. And my parents were also born there, and so were my grandparents, and back to, so far as we can guess, probably close to 500 years before me. We are Sephardic Jews, originating, of course, in Spain and or Portugal, and descendants of those that were expelled in 1492, and or may have converted originally and then come back to Judaism in the Ottoman Empire, which received most of the exiles of Spain and Portugal. My father, Joseph Amado, was worked most of his life for the American Tobacco Company in Izmir. The Aegean coast, where Izmir is located, is known for its tobacco, and American tobacco companies used to own fields and process tobacco there, and that's why my father was one of the few people who knew English. He had only an 8th grade education, but knew 7 languages, mostly because of where he was born, where Izmir, where there were many ethnic groups, and including Greeks, especially Greeks and Armenians, so he knew those languages as well as Hebrew, and of course at home we spoke Ladino or Spanish. We used to call it Espanol, but most people know it as Ladino. And my mother was also, as I said, born in Izmir, and she was a housewife. Her maiden name was Algranati, which was later turned to Algranti by my grandfather. And that last name shows the origins of the family, which was Granada, Spain. When I attended first a Jewish elementary school called Bene Berit, very close to our house. Our house in Izmir was just a few doors down or up from the synagogue on a main street. And across the street from the synagogue was the Jewish Bene Berit Elementary School, which is the one I attended for the first 4 grades of my education. And then I transferred to a Turkish public school. And after that, I attended the American school for girls called the American Collegiate Institute. My father wanted me to learn English as opposed to French, which had been the popular language until then. So I took the entrance exam and was accepted at the American school, and that's where I studied for 8 years. And since I graduated at the top of my class, I ended up with a full scholarship to the United States, to Lindenwood College in St. Charles, Missouri, which was also a girls' college. And from there I have a degree in chemistry. So to your question as to how we ended up in Dallas, I said it's a long story, so I'll make it short. I met my future husband, who is Bernard Bortnick, of course an Ashkenazi Jew of Russian Jewish descent, the first generation American, who was studying at Washington University in St. Louis. Together we went to Turkey. After graduating, we went to Turkey to get married. We got married in Izmir in the same synagogue near our house. And from there we went to Holland and lived in Rotterdam for 2 years, where Bernard worked as an architect for a former professor of his, who was a visiting professor in architecture from Holland. And so we lived in Rotterdam for 2 years. From there we went to Israel, and we lived in Israel for 2 years. Our first child was born there, and then we moved to Kansas City, where Bernard's family is. And from Kansas City, we moved back to St. Louis, where Bernard taught at Washington University, and then worked for another architect there, so we lived in St. Louis. For a total of 17 years, I forgot to mention that our second child was born in Izmir, because we were on the way to coming back from Israel to America. So I went home to have the baby. So my second child, a daughter, was born in Turkey. And we came back to America, Kansas City, and then back to St. Louis, where our third child was born. So each of our 3 children was born in a different country. And we lived in St. Louis for 17 years. Our children were raised there. And then Bernard was transferred to San Francisco, to the office in San Francisco of HOK Architects. And so we lived there for 6 years before Bernard got another job here in Dallas. So we moved to Dallas in 1988, and we've been here since. So that's our story.
What an educational experience, Rochelle. As a child, what were your Jewish affiliations? Did your family belong to a synagogue, and what was the extent of their participation? And how did you, as a Sephardic Jewish child, celebrate Jewish holidays in the Sephardic tradition as contrasted with Ashkenazi?
Well, of course, I knew nothing about Ashkenazi culture until I came to America. There were a few Ashkenazim in Turkey, but we didn't even know that name, that word, Ashkenazic, I think. At least I didn't as a child, because everybody was Sephardic, and the few Ashkenazim integrated to our society, so they spoke Spanish also. So our life was Sephardic, everything. We all Jewish people. When I was growing up, there were about 15,000 Jews in Izmir, Turkey. Most of them went to Israel in 1948, after 1948, in the first years of the State of Israel. But we stayed, and like I said, I went to the Jewish public school, and we lived very close to the synagogue. we were all observant Jews. By that, it does not mean Orthodox, because we had no separation. The first time I heard that there were divisions in the Jewish world was here in America. We were all observant, but not in the Orthodox sense, in that we kept kosher homes. The word kosher, by the way, is Ashkenazic. We say kasher, which is the Sephardic pronunciation. Everybody bought kasher meat from the kasher butcher. Everybody observed all the holidays. We all fasted on Yom Kippur. Now, my father worked on Saturdays, so he could not go to synagogue. You asked if we belonged to the synagogue. There was no such thing as belonging. There was a habit that the men had of going to the closest synagogue. And so we went there, and all the upkeep of the synagogue was by voluntary donations. So there was no system of paying yearly dues here as there is here. And so there no such thing as belonging in that case. But of course my father and my brother went to Bet Israel, which was our synagogue, and we had all the holidays were celebrated and observed. Shabbat, we did nothing. Even though my father worked, my mother did no work at all. And because she had a sister, first in Italy, then in Cuba, and then in America, and another sister in Barcelona, Spain, and another sister in Israel, Saturdays were the only time she could write, so without letting on to anybody that she was doing it, she used to write letters on Saturday. So we were sort of a little liberal in our observance of Shabbat, but no housework or cooking or anything was done on Shabbat. So without going into detail as to the differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazic observance, that sums up how we affiliated as Jews.
Rochelle, the food, Sephardic food, is very different from Ashkenazi, right? Especially for Pesach and other holidays.
Well, first of all, we lived in different parts of the world. Being Mediterranean culture, our cooking obviously had a lot of, and especially Turkey, which is a very fertile land, heavy on vegetables and olives and figs and almonds and all those things. Our cuisine involves vegetables, a lot of vegetables, and a lot of rice, and so the foods are totally different. You asked about Passover. I think you probably have heard that Sephardim are allowed to eat certain foods on Passover that Ashkenazim are not. This includes some Sephardic people do and some don't eat rice on Passover. We didn't. But some other foods that we did eat that Ashkenazim don't seem to eat are the beans. We eat green beans and whatever other regular vegetables that Ashkenazim are not allowed to eat.
So there's quite a difference between the two cultures.
Oh yes, food is
Traditionally,
only one of them. Food is
culture.
only one of them, and the main thing is, let me tell you this story that might be interesting. When I came to America to school, the one condition that my parents put was that I meet a Jewish family in St. Charles, where the school was located, near St. Louis, and go there every Shabbat to observe Shabbat, Friday night. And so the school helped me find this family, and that was my first introduction to an Ashkenazic family. I was there on a Friday night, and the first thing I noticed was that Mr. and Mrs. Kaplan were speaking a language that was not English, but I didn't know what it was. But I didn't ask, I was shy. Then we sat around a very nicely set table. They were very observant Jews. Mr. Kaplan started to say what was supposed to be the Kiddush for Friday night, and we said the Kiddush every Friday night in our house, but I didn't understand a word that Mr. Kaplan said. Once in a while I'd recognize a few words, but it seemed like he didn't know how to pronounce the Hebrew. Well, I later found out that he was chanting the Ashkenazic style and pronouncing the words Ashkenazic style, which were almost incomprehensible to me, even though I knew the whole...
To the Sephardic style.
Right, exactly. Then the food started coming, and she brought a platter of something that were like white balls. And so I said, "What is that, Mrs. Kaplan?" And she said, "What, you don't know what this is?" And I said, "No." She said, that's gefilte fish. And I said, "This is fish?" She said, "You don't even recognize gefilte fish. What kind of a Jew are you?" And I said, "Well, I know fish. We eat a lot of fish. We eat fish on Friday night, but our fish looks like fish." And so then she brought other things that also were very new to me. And when I asked what language, I finally asked what language they were speaking among themselves. She said, "You don't know Jewish?" And I said, "Jewish to me is either Hebrew or Spanish." And she said, "What Spanish?" She said, "I don't know if you're Jewish." She said, "I don't think you're Jewish." Anyway, so
did she say Yiddish? Did she tell you it was Yiddish?
Yeah, she told me it was Yiddish, but she knew nothing about Ashkenazic or Sephardic. So I think finally got convinced that I was Jewish, since it was so important to my parents that I go to a Jewish home. But I think there was always a doubt in their mind. So that so far, and of course this dialogue about you don't eat gefilte fish, what kind of a Jew are you? You don't know Yiddish, what kind of a Jew are you? Happened maybe hundreds of times during my life in the United States with other people.
So Rochelle, you had many cultural contrasting experiences.
Many.
With
Yeah.
the Jewish population here.
Yeah. Even my mother-in-law, who intellectually knew that I was Jewish and was convinced I was Jewish, because my father-in-law did know all about Sephardic Jews. He was a very well self-educated man. But my mother-in-law every once in a while would say, "You know, Rachel," by the way, my name became Rachel in the United States. It's easier for people to pronounce. "You know, Rachel should say Jewish people cook this way." And I used to say, "Mama, please don't say Jewish people. Please say Ashkenazic people, because we're Jewish and we don't cook it this way." Or she'd say, on another occasion, "Rachel, you know what Jewish people say?" And she'd blurt out something in Yiddish. And I'd say, "Mama, that's what Ashkenazic people say, not Jewish people." So things like that went on many, many times.
How interesting. How
Yeah.
interesting. Rochelle, you definitely brought the Sephardic culture and the Sephardic traditions and the Sephardic awareness to the people of Dallas. And we are deeply indebted to you for bringing that knowledge to us and the culture as well. Rochelle, I would like to ask about your work activities as an adult. You've had college instructional experience. You've worked with foreign students. Would you like to tell us about some of that work
Yes,
and
very
some
briefly.
of the projects that were significant for you?
Well, very briefly, even though my degree was in chemistry, the children were small, I didn't work, and then I started working in chemistry and didn't like it. In the late 1970s, Russian Jews were coming to St. Louis, and I had done some private teaching of English as a young person in Turkey, and so I thought I would really like to be involved in teaching English to the Russian immigrants that were coming. And I had a friend who was teaching at the synagogue where we belonged. We belonged to a conservative synagogue in St. Louis. And so I said I'd like to do that. At the time it was a voluntary thing, and I went and I observed, and the director said, "Sure, you come, and we need teachers, more and more people are coming." And I started teaching, and then in a few years they were asked to accept Vietnamese and Laotian immigrants who were coming also. And they said that but the teachers had to have teaching certificates, but they would pay for us to go back to school, get some classes, and give us temporary certificates. To make a long story short, I went and took classes in adult education. There was no ESL master's program available at the time in St. Louis. And so I became a teacher of English as a second language, and that's what I did for over 30 years, both in St. Louis, then in the Bay Area of San Francisco, then here in Dallas. I worked with Jewish Family Services first, and then for 5 years, and then I transferred to Brookhaven College and taught there.
With Jewish Family Service, which immigrant population did you work with?
Mostly Russian Jews.
Russian Jews.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
5 years?
Yes, 5 years I worked there. Then the Russian immigration slowed down, and they were getting some Iranian Jews, and also a few non-Jews were coming there. But finally I saw that the student population was getting less, and I really wanted to teach in a more academic setting, so I transferred to Brookhaven College.
Now, Rochelle, I believe you taught credit
Yes, I
ESL
taught
classes,
credit there.
which is different from continuing education.
Yes. I
Okay.
taught for credit for people who wanted to go to college or university here and needed to pass.
What were your experiences like working with a nationalistic population? I'm sure you
Oh,
had
I
different
loved
national.
it.
Okay.
I loved my
Elaborate
job.
on that for a minute.
I think the students felt very comfortable with me because English being my second language, I knew exactly what was difficult and what needed to be explained to students so that they would get over both the grammatical and the pronunciation problems that the various people had. It was very challenging and very interesting at the same time, but I had a very good rapport with each of the students, and it was very, very satisfying to see their progress.
So, Rochelle, it was very personally rewarding for you.
Yes, yes, and working with immigrants was also very rewarding. I still see the people around here at the JCC and so on who just hug me every time, Rachel, the Russian students.
So this has undoubtedly been one of the projects that's most memorable to you.
Yes, absolutely.
In your work career.
Absolutely. I'm recently retired, and I am so busy that I don't think about it, but when I think about my teaching experience, I miss it.
Rochelle, have you been active in any civic organizations in Dallas or Jewish organization? I believe you were president of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society.
Yes,
Would
I
you
was
please
president
elaborate on that?
after Reed Heller. Reed Heller asked me to consider taking over after he left. So I was president, I believe, from 96 to 98. I don't remember exactly. But I was president, and at the time I organized 2 Jewish heritage tours to Turkey on behalf of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. So that was one. Other than that, I'm a passive supporter of civic and Jewish organizations. I'm a life member of Hadassah, and I support other organizations, but I'm not active. Like you mentioned, I was instrumental in bringing Sephardic festivals to the JCC in collaboration with Judith Cohen. But other than that, I'm not active.
To me, that was very significant when you brought Sephardic festivals to the JCC with Judy Cohen. Could you elaborate on that? Was it Sephardic music? Was it Sephardic history? And how successful your first event was?
Oh yes, I forgot. You mentioned Sephardic history. I also taught Sephardic history and even Ladino language at the educational programs of the JCC. They used to have something called Joys of Jewish Learning, where I taught for a few years. I also taught there English as a second language in the evenings at the JCC. So the festivals themselves were music mostly, but we also cooked, and it had a culinary component where, since everything had to be kasher, we had to cook everything in the kitchens of the JCC, and we made a big deal of the food part, which was served after the concert. it was those were very successful events, if I may say so, but very hard to. The idea of doing it again sort of scares me because it was so much work. We had a committee, of course.
I remember that very well, Rochelle. And you were certainly instrumental in bringing that facet of the Sephardic culture to Dallas, the music.
Yes, well, some people have heard, but it was interesting. I have also lectured on different occasions on the Sephardic experience in the Holocaust. And one time I spoke to the docents of the Holocaust Center here. And it was after we had had all these Sephardic classes and Sephardic festivals and so on. And yet, after I talked about the Sephardic experience in the Holocaust, where we lost most of our natives, Ladino speakers, in Greece and Yugoslavia and so on, a man raised his hand and said, "But I don't understand." He said, if those people didn't speak Yiddish, were they Jews? So I had to explain it over again. So some people still haven't heard that there are Jews who never spoke Yiddish.
Also, Rochelle, I remember very well that you introduced me to Sephardic people here in Dallas. And they had similar experiences that you did when they came here.
Right, every Sephardic person had it. Even in New York and Los Angeles, where there were many Sephardic people, each one will tell you similar stories.
Back to Ladino, teaching Ladino at the Jewish Community Center. Ladino is what exactly? Could you elaborate on that for a few minutes?
Well,
and what kind of students did you have in that Ladino class?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Thank you. First, what is Ladino? Ladino is, to be exact, a Spanish-based language that developed in the Ottoman Empire among the Sephardic people, and which over time incorporated some elements of Turkish and the other languages that it came in contact with, including French later on, but Italian. It has some Portuguese and some old medieval Spanish or Iberic dialects like Catalan and Aragonese and so on in it. So it's a mixture, but basically it's medieval Castilian. And if we speak to a Spanish-speaking person, we know the differences between our language and modern Spanish. We can make ourselves understood. And we certainly understand Spanish, modern Spanish, because the differences are small. Reading modern Castilian is a little difficult because they write very complicated sentences, but basically we can get by. It's I think closer, Ladino's closer to Spanish than Yiddish would be to German. We have a lot of Hebrew influence too, but mostly related to our holidays and Jewish ritual observance and so on. You know, the names of the holidays, Kippur, Pesach, and so on, Shabbat, things like that.
Rochelle, I have heard people state that Ladino is a 15th century Spanish. What is your take on that?
Well, like I said, yes, it is.
Okay.
Pre-15th century, but that's the basis of it. And it's the grammar. But there's also a Ladino, which we find in our sacred or liturgical texts, which are word-by-word translations from Hebrew, from the Hebrew text. By the way, Ladino is also used in the synagogue. That's one difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazic, which Ashkenazim don't use Yiddish in the synagogue. They have that as the secular language, whereas Ladino is used in the synagogues. Many prayers and songs are sung in Ladino. So it's there are, you can say there are two Ladinos. One is this translation from the Hebrew, which follows the Hebrew syntax, and one is the spoken Ladino, which follows basically the Spanish syntax.
Rochelle, I feel this has been a very significant part of your connection with Sephardic history and Ladino. It's my understanding that your ancestry is Spanish and Portuguese. Mm-hmm. And I believe you shared with me, Rochelle, that the Spanish government or Spanish universities invited you to go back to Spain and you had a Spanish connection. Would you like to elaborate on that for a few minutes?
I have always been active in Sephardic affairs. Maybe because I'm so isolated from it and frustrated that people don't know about who I am and what culture I come from. So one of the things that I have done is, as much as possible, attended symposia or conferences having to do with our culture. And in one of these was in 1999. I attended a conference in Israel, in Jerusalem, on how we should spell Ladino in Latin letters, because Ladino also traditionally was written in Hebrew characters, like Yiddish was, but now very few people use the Hebrew characters, and so we don't have a standard way of spelling the language. So anyway, at that conference, somebody said that the internet, which was new, coming into popularity at the time, would be a good way to spread and popularize a standardized method of spelling. And they mentioned something about forming a correspondence group. So when I came back here, I asked my friend Reed Heller, I said, what is this about? I had just gotten a computer. And so I said, what are these correspondence groups? How do you start one? So he told me how to do it. It was very simple. So I started I contacted a few friends and I said, would you be part of a Ladino correspondence group? And so we started one, and this was like December of 1999, and the thing mushroomed. I named it Ladino Comunità, and today we have over 1,300 members, not all of whom write, but all of whom read our Ladino. And so via this correspondence group, we have members from over 30 countries. And so many of whom are in Latin America. And one day I wrote and asked on this group if anybody in Buenos Aires knew a friend of mine who was my neighbor and friend. We had gone to the Jewish school together and then to the Turkish public school together. Her name was Alegre Saban. I said, does anybody in Buenos Aires know the family Saban, which emigrated from Izmir, Turkey, early 1950s. And a couple of people answered, yes, of course we know them. So that put me in touch with a childhood friend of mine, whom I later, by the way, went to Argentina and met after 60 years. But anyway, through her, her nephew lives in Spain and is a professor there in Barcelona, and had just formed an organization to spread the knowledge of Judaism in Spain called Tarbut Sefarad. And so his name is Mario Saban. And Mario contacted me and said, as founder of Ladino Comunità, I'd like to invite you to come and give lectures in different cities of Spain about your culture and your language. You choose your subject. And so, to make the long story short, in 2008, Bernard and I went to Spain, and we rented a car, and I ended up lecturing in 11 cities, most of whom do not have a single Jewish resident, in different venues organized by representatives of Tarbut Sefarad in that town or city. And it was a very, very interesting experience. I lectured in Ladino, trying not to use the foreign words that we have in Ladino, and but still using my medieval Spanish, and they were fascinated by my language and by the fact that we kept our Spanishness for so many centuries since they threw us out. That was a very interesting experience.
So Rochelle, this was really an incredible reconnection with
Yes.
your Sephardic
As a matter of
culture
fact,
connection.
yes, I call it my return to Sepharad. And I did a presentation on that for the Jewish Historical Society, I think in 2009.
Well, how interesting. This was very significant, and it certainly will return to your roots
Yes,
and to your culture and your language.
right.
And the people were receptive to you in Spain.
Very, very, very receptive, amazingly so. There was one of the most interesting places was in Don Quixote country, in La Mancha, the La Mancha area, and a small town called El Toboso. Interestingly, had one of the largest audiences there, and very formal. The mayor, the stage was decorated with flowers and so on. It was the town historian, the mayor were there, as well as the representative of Tarbut Sefarad, and the Jews have been absent from Spain for hundreds of years. Now they're slowly returning, let's say. But most of these places had never seen a Jew. All their knowledge is from what they read. So, and the anti-Jewishness that they have been fed in their Catholic churches and so on, once in a while popped out. And of all people, it would come out from what seemingly were the most educated people. And anyway, I don't want to go into what that comment was, but it really came out in certain people in their questions afterwards as to whether Jews were two-faced people. Anyway, so that was one of the more memorable experiences, yes.
One other question about Ladino, Sephardim, and teaching Ladino. Rochelle, I would like to say that you certainly discovered a group of people here in Texas that some of them took your class and they discovered
yes.
their Jewish roots, known as converso Jews.
Yes,
People
I forgot
don't know
to,
what this means. Could you elaborate on that for a minute?
Yes, yes. Many of the people who took my class were Spanish speakers. In fact, for the language, I required that they have some knowledge of Spanish. Because I'm not going to start teaching them uno, dos, tres. I mean, it's. I just wanted them to realize what the basic differences were and that how we can still understand each other and so on. So among the people who came were some of Mexican or Old Texan descent. And as I talked, some of them asked me about Sephardic customs. And once I brought in my wedding pictures, which were, as I had mentioned, we were married in our synagogue in Turkey, the Sephardic way. And one of the customs that one student particularly noticed was that instead of standing under chuppah, we throw the prayer shawl, the talit, over our heads of the bride and groom. And he said, well, in our family, we, only in our family, not all Catholics do this, but we have that custom at the wedding of throwing a shawl over the people. And then as we talked, he went back home and started asking questions, David Jimenez, questions in the family about why we do this. And he found out that his ancestry was Jewish and they had converted to Christianity. And since then, I met many others in Dallas who had been raised Catholic, or in one case, other Christian sects, but who found out that they were originally Sephardic Jews who had converted. And some customs, some Jewish customs, had been kept in their families as vestiges of their old Jewish customs. But most often they didn't know why they had those Jewish customs. Oh, one of them, which was very popular, it seemed among several families, was that when somebody died, they covered the mirrors. And others didn't eat pork and had a custom of slaughtering the animals that they did eat themselves. It turned out the Jewish way. Some had the custom of lighting candles on Friday night, but in secret, in a place where nobody would know, or somehow putting a white tablecloth on Friday nights at the table, things like that. Anyway, these are the people that are nowadays called either crypto-Jews or conversos, and they are, some of them in Dallas even have been interested in returning to Judaism. And in the meantime, I became one of the associations where I'm active, and in fact, I'm on the board now, is the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, based in Los Angeles. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to their conference in August in San Diego.
Crypto meaning secret.
Secret Jews, and there are many in the United States.
In the southwestern part.
Mostly southwestern part, but also Texas, South Texas.
See, Rochelle, what a revelation you were to these people
Yes.
in assisting them in discovering their Jewish roots when they did not understand these traditions that were practiced among their families that other Hispanics did not practice.
Exactly.
What a revelation, Rochelle.
Of course, in Dallas, I must mention that Reed Heller does a lot of research on that also. So I'm not the only one.
Rochelle, who are your role models?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I have role models. I think probably my parents, but I don't live up to their level of devotion to Jewish tradition.
What changes have you seen in Dallas since you've moved here, Rochelle?
Oh yes, as I said, we came in 1988. This is, of course, something that everybody has noticed, the way it has built up. But having moved here from the Bay Area, I was really unhappy and seemed like there was nothing here when I first came. But I am just delighted with the art scene in Dallas. I was very impressed that Dallas had one of the first Holocaust centers in the country, and it's amazing to see how the Holocaust Center has grown, but how the downtown has these fantastic new buildings. And of course, my husband, since he retired being an artist, we're more involved in the art scene. And so I think Dallas has, on the one hand, grown for the better in the urbanization of the downtown, but on the other hand, I don't like the spread, the way Dallas has spread out and depends so much on cars,
Transportation.
individual.
Rochelle, what are you most proud of in your...
I have to tell you that culturally, I was always taught that pride is not a good thing.
Okay.
And so I cannot say that I'm proud. I cannot talk about what I have achieved. And I cannot see that what my children or my husband has achieved is a reflection of me. That's their achievements. And so I would not say that I'm proud of anything, because I think that's an American concept and not one that I like to say.
Tell me about your family today, Rochelle.
Oh, my family, I have, my 3 children are each in a different part of the country, which is very well, no, thank God one is here in Dallas. Unfortunately, none of them are married. So, and what does disturb me is that I never taught them Ladino. They know about the foods, more or less. My oldest son, who studied in Brazil, understands my Ladino more or less through his Portuguese. But basically, they are not going to carry on the Sephardic culture, or even identity, except that to say that their mother was Sephardic. I have to say, though, that I am very glad, I'm not going to say proud, but glad, that when I was living in the Bay Area in California, a filmmaker did a movie with me called Trees Cry for Rain, a Sephardic Journey. And that film has been shown in many Jewish film festivals, from Sweden to Israel and all over, and here in the United States. And my children each have a copy of that. So I think that my legacy will stay through that. And the Sephardic legacy and the legacy of Ladino, we're keeping it alive, so us older people who still speak it via, and passing it on to some young people via Ladino Comunità on the internet. But mostly it's the songs, the music that will live forever, I think. But it's very important to stress, and this is the last thing I want to say, that singers of Ladino songs, excuse me, need to sing those songs authentically, need to know the meanings and to pronounce the words correctly, because one of the main differences between Ladino and Spanish is the pronunciation of words, and they need to find an authentic person to teach them the songs and the pronunciation.
Absolutely.
And not learn it from other records which may or may not have the right pronunciation.
Rochelle, in concluding our oral interview, is there anything you want to add?
I want to express to you my thanks for doing this. I hope that Sephardic culture, the good things about Sephardic culture, that is the fact that we don't have a history of living in ghettos, in shtetls, of being more open to the advancements of the society at large. If you ask me if I had a role model, certainly not a role model, but a person that I'm very proud, really, in this case, to know that he was a Sephardic person, and that is the legacy of Maimonides, who himself was not only a rabbi, but a doctor, a physician, and an open and had friends in the Arab world. And I think the fact that we Sephardic people lived among Muslims and lived without any distinguishing dress and were open to learn from others, would become part of the Jewish world, especially those that are not open, that think that the survival of Judaism depends on being isolated. I don't agree with that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rochelle. This has been very personally rewarding.
Thank you.
And mil gracias.
De nada.